Throughout this Shabbaton, we have heard a variety of perspectives about the state of affairs on college campuses today. In this final panel discussion, we are honored to welcome Julia Jassey, co-founder and chief executive officer of Jewish on Campus.
Jewish on Campus is the leading voice for Jewish students in the United States, combating anti-Semitism, engaging in grassroots activism, and advocating for the Jewish community. Julia's work has been recognized widely in the Jewish community and beyond, featured on CNN, CBS, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, and other international news outlets.
Working together with students around the country, she has advocated for students at every level, from university administrators to the White House as a contributor to the national strategy to combat anti-Semitism.
She was awarded the Anti-Defamation League's Concert Against Hate for her leadership in the Jewish community, and she was considered one of Al Jazeera magazine's top 100 people positively influencing Jewish life in 2021. She graduated from the University of Chicago in 2023, where she studied political science and Jewish studies.
Welcome, Julia. Thank you for being with us at PAS today.
Thank you, gentlemen. Julia, welcome. It's great to have you here. It is a novel thing, I know, that at a Shabbaton talking about anti-Semitism on campus, to actually speak to someone who recently graduated and had started in an organization. I mean, we've heard from donors, from administrators, from you were just sitting in on the session with the president of Michigan. So it's nice to actually hear from an individual who not only experienced what's happening on campus, but actually did something about it. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about your story. I just want to begin with a selection from an article you wrote in Sapir in the Resilience edition from 2024 from the spring. An excellent article which we should post somewhere. You can graduate anytime you like, but you can never leave. Were you intentionally kind of paraphrasing the Eagles there?
A little
okay,
bit,
just
yeah.
want to make sure. Because sometimes I would say Eagles and people your age might have no idea who I'm talking about.
No, this is one person who
great.
will know what
Okay,
we're talking about.
good. All right. I'm just going to read a short part of it. Anti-Zionist organizations are often collectively led by diffuse groups of students. By contrast, the flagship Jewish organizations on campus are centrally run by an older generation of leaders. Student perspectives and initiatives can take a back seat, especially in fast-changing environments. Moreover, students are by default not pushed into leadership. What can follow is a lack of resolve, then silence. It's time we turn the tables. You have turned the tables. Before we get to how you turned the tables, give us a little backstory here on how you arrived at this decision where something had to give.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it, and it's great to be here. I really got involved with this work totally by accident. I'm from Long Island, and as you guys probably know from living up here, never was in a place where I'd be the only Jewish person in a room. And I got to college, and that experience totally changed. I went to the University of Chicago. Go Maroons is way less fun to say than Go Blue. But I found myself, like any college student, trying to find clubs I wanted to join, RSOs I wanted to join, and I decided to join the French club. And I don't speak French, but they had baguettes and cheese, and I was a college student, so I went to the French club. And I was sitting there and not knowing a word they were saying, except one word, which was Nazi. And so I interrupt the conversation, and I said in English, "Why are you talking about Nazis?" And I said, my family, I had a lot of family that passed away in the Holocaust, my father's great-grandparents, why are you speaking about Nazis? And a student who was studying abroad in the US from Germany responded and said, back home in Germany, we don't say that your family died in the Holocaust. We said they take an extended vacation to Germany and never came home. Yeah, that was like my reaction too. And I had no idea what to say because I'd never experienced anything like that. I was never in a room where I would be the only Jew also kind of with everyone's eyes on me. And I realized not knowing how to respond almost felt worse than what he said. And then as I was having more experiences like that, it really drove me to decide that I would never want to not know how to respond again. And so I ended up like getting a Jewish studies degree and doing all of those things. But Jewish on Campus was really born out of the idea of how can we talk about anti-Semitism, not be afraid of calling it anti-Semitism, and then figure out together as the next generation of Jewish leaders how to respond to it.
So if I understand the history correctly, it started off as a social media organization essentially while you were in college, and I think this was going on through COVID as well.
Yeah.
So how did that develop, right? And I want to come back to social media because President Ono mentioned this in his remarks, and the role that social media plays in not only disseminating anti-Semitism or anti-Zionist, sentiments, but how do we, effectively use social media to, on offense. But tell us how it went from a social media Instagram account to you now have a company, you now have an organization that you're the CEO of the organization.
Absolutely. So I kind of always joke that Jewish on Campus as a nonprofit started totally by accident. We started and we were, like you mentioned, an Instagram page. And the goal was very simple. At the time, it was 6 college students who were on a phone call at midnight and said, what if we start an Instagram page when we just tell the stories of campus anti-Semitism? No one was talking about it. This was before there were CNN headlines and New York Times think pieces. There was nothing at this point. This was 4.5 years ago. But the problem was there. And so we said, okay, what if we create a platform on social media, which in the middle of COVID was the town square for Jewish students. It was how they were sharing information. It was how they were spreading misinformation. And what if we share these stories? And it became really successful really quickly. And we realized that we had a platform, and you can do a lot more with the platform than just post, not to undermine the power of social media, but you can do more. And so we decided to create a nonprofit organization, which I now run full-time post-grad, and work with college students all over the country in cultivating the next generation of Jewish leadership. But it really kind of was a series of events that were all responding to needs that we've been addressing before October 7th and since.
Yeah, so that's an important piece of this puzzle. This was well before October 7th. We know there were issues on campus before October 7th, even though we've spent a great deal of time in the last 24 hours talking about post-October 7th. So tell us some of so you're sort of accumulating these stories. Tell us some of the stories you were hearing. What were students confronting, encountering on campus pre-10/7?
Yeah. One story that I think, I'll actually take a step back. You have the big stories that make headlines every day, and then you have the smaller ones, the everyday examples of someone saying they're Jewish, like my colleague who's here actually went to Tufts, who, as a freshman in his group chat entering college, one of his classmates said, "I'm Jewish," and the response was, "Israel or Palestine?" Those little everyday instances were impacting Jewish students on an everyday level, and then there were really big instances which kind of predated and gave us a sense of what was coming after October 7th. And probably the strongest example that stands out to me as a precursor of what was to come was a group of students who went to the SUNY New Paltz, State University of New York in New Paltz. And we ended up filing a Title VI complaint, which is a complaint to the Department of Education, Civil Rights Department, to really make sure that these students were having action from the university. But this was many years ago, and these were two college students who both were survivors of sexual violence. One of them was Israeli, and one of them was Jewish, and shared on her social media, very common, innocuous, Israel is a Jewish homeland, or a picture from Birthright. And these were students one of whom actually helped to create a support group for survivors of sexual violence. And the goal was to find space, commonality. And both of these students weren't only kicked out of this group for survivors, but were publicly shamed. Their stories were publicly delegitimized, publicly harassed. And today we see, once again, stories of survivors post-October 7th publicly demonized, publicly ignored. And so we see these things that were happening before October 7th, and they were happening at a smaller scale. But the little bits were there that have just grown since then.
So one of the things we've recognized since October 7th, and I'm sure you're going to agree with this, is just the number of people that we have turning to the synagogue, trying to make sense, Jews who are aware of their identity in some way, but obviously post 10/7 took a different turn. I remember immediately in the aftermath of 10/7, we hosted a number of Zooms with college kids, just space for them to be and process. And I imagine that the scope of your work changed significantly post 10/7. Can you talk about that moment and sort of what that did to the work that you do?
Absolutely. We always sort of say that we weren't shocked by the response on October 8th because we'd seen these seeds there, but we were shocked by the gravity. I mean, it became overnight a popular opinion, or the popular opinion, to believe that any student who believes that Israel should exist in any form that they might politically view that is a kind of a person that is a pariah on campus, that you can't join your campus clubs or campus identity groups. We had students at at Columbia University, just not far, who wanted to join dance groups, and their dance groups would not have space for students that they called Zionists, and they were kicked out, and it was awful. They couldn't engage in Jewish campus life. And so we really had to find ways to respond. And the biggest challenge, and one thing that I think maybe is the most disturbing situation that happened since October 7th at Columbia University. Right after October 7th, the university tried to host a day of dialogue, saying, okay, this is a really fraught time. How can we bring together students to speak? And the day of dialogue was boycotted. When you have students that are boycotting dialogue, how are you ever supposed to bring them to the table? So there becomes two issues that we have to solve. One is responding reactively, filing complaints with the Department of Education, meeting with university administrators, and meeting with groups of Jewish professors that are working with Jewish students, and finding ways to react to those instances. And then there are the proactive things. How can we educate students on campus and off campus? How can we understand how we can reach students who otherwise, non-Jewish students and Jewish students alike, not understand why this moment has anti-Semitism and why this problem is growing. And how can we do that both as a reaction to instances that are happening and also as a proactive measure against it? How can we empower these students and find ways to make them not afraid or even know how to use their voice in media, to speak to reporters for the New York Times, or to go on BBC and debate a student who is saying that you don't have a right to exist, which happens. But those students, like myself, often don't know how to respond. And so how can we give them those tools so they have that strength going into it?
When you say we, tell us about your organization a little bit. I mean, we know of some of these legacy organizations that are doing this work. You have this like startup energy, right? You haven't been doing this as long as the ADL has, and yet like you're basically a few years out from being on campus, right? So you more than anyone understand what's happening on campus. What have you built, right, to as a framework to do this work when you talk about all the things that you want to do, train these kids to be able to speak to press, educate them about Israel, Jewish identity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is a big lift, right?
Absolutely. Jewish on Campus, why we started. The goal has always been to address a need that was missing. Never to be redundant, we're not here to create a new home for Jewish students that exists. What doesn't exist or hadn't existed is a voice for Jewish students. And we look at groups like SJP, and what they're able to do, there are plenty of extremely irresponsible things, and everything that they do is quite harmful for our community. What they've been able to do successfully is reach young people. The popular opinion on campuses is the opinion of SJP, and the language and work of SJP most often is what can spread a lot of anti-Semitism, what causes people to boycott days of dialogue, what causes people to not allow Zionists in their dance club was a petition that goes around by SJP. So yes, it's really dangerous, but it's also something we need to learn from, because what are we missing to not hit that? And so what Jewish on Campus is here to do is to reach young people in ways that legacy organizations could never do because they are legacy organizations. How can we create something that will reach young people because it's fresh, because it speaks their language, and because it can reach them in a way that sounds like them, that represents their feelings on campus. And so what that work looks like is creating, of course, student leaders. And we have, just in our leadership programs, over 100 students on over 60 campuses around the country. Our pilot year, we have 10 chapters just to start that are already educating students and creating the same way that you'd think of an SJP proactively teaching students. We should be doing the same thing, and it can't just come from professionals. It needs to come from other students. And how can we enable and empower these students to use their stories and share them in ways that hasn't happened previously? So building a kind of a gritty grassroots group of Jewish students that are able to reach not just other Jews, but beyond, and share their stories in a way that can be impactful.
Julia, I know you're talking about college campuses right now. That's the work you do. But you live in New York City. You're aware of sort of you're aware of what's happening in the ongoing schools, the private schools, the public schools. I have the real privilege of being one of the representatives at my daughter's school in the Jewish affinity group, dealing with the administration on a number of issues. It's like running up and pounding my head on the wall type of thing. And I've long felt that these private schools are like the farm system for the anti-Israel, anti-Semitism sentiments on campus. Do you work, does your organization, let's talk about that, right? These ongoing schools. B, do you work with any of these kids in these private schools who are, I know there are other organizations, but again, right, it's different when it's different when you walk in the door to talk to these kids versus someone who's, whom they may not be able to relate to as easily and is speaking a different language, frankly.
Absolutely. In private high schools?
Yeah, we'll stick with the private high schools for
Absolutely. So I think right now that there are two main issues on campus. This is for all campuses. And we're seeing, elementary school students that are having problems right now. This is not a problem that I dealt with in high school. My sister dealt with it when she was in high school more recently. There's the administrative problem where administrators are not understanding the issues of anti-Semitism and aren't taking appropriate action to stop it. And there's a social problem among students, because you can have every university administration take the best action against anti-Semitism, and that won't stop those students socially to have a real inability to understand the experience of Jewish students and why they are feeling unsafe at this time. And our work historically has focused on college campuses because we always have sought to represent the people who we are. So we were college students. It started when we were in college. And we wanted to speak to that group. But more and more and more, we are hearing from high school students and younger that are looking for that same support at their schools. And of course, I work with those students on a one-on-one basis, but in creating and speaking, I've spoken to Jewish college students all over the world, from Spain to here in New York, about how we can give them those tools so they don't head to campus feeling unable and unprepared. And as we are growing our work out and growing our organization, I've been off campus. I graduated in 2023, and we've been working full-time since then and are growing as an organization. And one of our growth goals is to create more programming for high school students. But really, right now, what we do is we speak to students, speak to parents, and talk to them about how they can head to campus feeling less like they're unprepared and more like whatever might happen, they have those tools to combat it.
So let's talk about the campus right now, because I think both of our speakers today struck a very optimistic tone about campus. Santa Ono seems to think that things are under control at Michigan. We had somebody from Columbia this morning. Obviously, there's some serious issues at Columbia in the past week, but he was suggesting that overall it was much better than it had been when the encampments were really raging. What's your take as someone closer to the situation, like on the ground? What's your take on these campuses? Are things better? You were talking a few minutes ago, predating 10/7. There were all kinds of issues. What's the state of play right now, you think?
Absolutely. it's really hard for things to get worse than they were last spring. I mean, I'm here in New York. I would get texts from my Columbia students every day, bless you, with different problems happening at their school. And it was horrendous and horrific to see how these students felt unsafe. I mean, seeing Jewish students being beaten up, trying to get back to their dormitories before Shabbat, like that's hard to beat. And I think one thing that we learned from that experience is that we cannot wait for instances of anti-Semitism to happen to do something. I think that we have really been accepting a bit of a status quo where, yeah, things are bad, but like they've been worse. And yeah, spring was the worst that it can get, but Jewish students still on a day-to-day have this feeling of, I can't tell people where my grandparents were from. Or maybe I don't want to put Hillel on my resume because I might be excluded from a job offer. Or I don't feel, safe walking to class because of a protest that's interrupting, a class on Israeli history. Those things are still parts of everyday life and everyday experiences. And so our goal now as people working on this issue needs to be not waiting for things to be the worst to do something, and not accepting that the status quo has to be how it always is.
So we'll get to questions, I promise. So let's talk about that taking the offensive here, right? You say in the article, you emphasize that students should play a leading role in combating anti-Semitism. Can you share a little bit some examples of how this leadership has changed sort of campus dynamics? Like what have students taken on that has shifted the goalposts a little bit?
Absolutely. You look at the activism that happens with Gen Z, and you can see really powerful examples. I mean, you can see students, for example, in groups like March for Our Lives, where these were young students that led something that led to change. And Jewish students historically haven't had that path, haven't had an avenue to be voices, to be leaders for our community, and that's what we are creating and doing. And there are ways to do that in small ways, and then ways to do that are bigger. A lot of those bigger ways look like, for example, a lot of work speaking to members of Congress, sharing their stories and their experiences, and prompting that to be a piece of action. I mean, we saw so many of our students involved in creating the National Strategy to Combat Anti-Semitism that the White House put out in 2023. Yes, 2023. We saw students that have been working with the Department of Education since then who have put their names proudly to articles in the New York Times and shown, their faces proudly talking about the issue of anti-Semitism on CNN. These really big platforms where they know that they might face bullying and hate on campus for doing it, but they know that it's important. And I think that's the most important thing. When you feel intimidated, and that the cost outweighs the benefit, that your words might not have enough power to outweigh the harassment that you're going to receive, then you're never going to have the opportunity to share your story. And what we've seen from students that I think is really powerful is when one student does something, then their peers see it and they'll want to do it, and then their peers will see it and they'll want to do it. And it creates a chain reaction where people feel more empowered to speak. And we've really seen that successfully on campuses now and continuing to grow in years to come.
So you just threw out some big things, right? And I assume part of your work is trying to empower some of these students to find their voice and to have the moral courage and the courageous voice. And you also mentioned little things. What are some of the smaller things that students can do who may not want to be standing in front of groups of people or go on television or be quoted in the New York Times or whatever it may be? Give me some smaller.
Absolutely. Pardon my pun here, not unintentional, but there are so many different ways to be Jewish on campus. And for some students, that looks like those big things. But for other students, it is a complete act of bravery to put a mezuzah on their dorm because they have seen it being torn down for other students. Or wear a kippah or Magen David, or just to go to Shabbat dinners, to join a Jewish sorority or fraternity, to take a Jewish studies class. Those small things that we totally take for granted at a time when you might not feel comfortable fully wearing your identity on your sleeve are actually important and actually brave. And again, when you see your friend wearing a Magen David, maybe you'll feel more strong to wear yours too. And I think that we take for granted those little things. And I will say, as someone that sometimes does those big things, those little things have become more important for me too. deciding to wear my Magen David wear my Magen David every single day and have that be a part of my identity. Going to services more is something that I started doing in college after I started doing this work. Finding ways to connect beyond just anti-Semitism. Because if anti-Semitism is defining your Judaism, you're not going to be able to do it for very long. You're not going to be able to push on for very long. You have to really care about what you're fighting for. And I think we've seen students do that in so many different ways, and it's really powerful.
On the holidays, I quoted a jeweler in the congregation who told me that there was a 1,700% increase in sales in Magen Davids. That the number of people who were taking those little steps and who weren't necessarily being defined, their Judaism wasn't being defined by anti-Semitic acts. Their Judaism was being defined by embracing a Jewish life. And you've mentioned this. I'd like to just push a little harder on the conversations you have with students. How do you, when students come to you, they've experienced something or they're just generally frustrated with campus, how do you work with them to help them find their voice and to find that joy in being Jewish?
Absolutely. There is action that you can take, and that action can vary. Some students, that action is sharing their story. It's creating, I think we really underestimate the power of social media. That is where a lot of the mis and disinformation is spreading. So using also social media to spread true stories is really impactful. Sometimes that looks like meeting with university administrators or groups, again, of Jewish professors that are doing this work. Sometimes that is talking to press. Sometimes that's filing complaints with the Department of Education or local government officials. Those are all options, and that's part of it. But the other part of it is how can you articulate your story? And part of that comes with knowledge of, first of all, how do we even explain why what happened was anti-Semitic, which is knowledge that when I was a freshman in college, I lacked. So how can we give these students the tools and resources to understand that? And some of that comes from the training programs that we have for our students. We're bringing in educators and then teaching them how to be peer educators for their classmates on campus. But also part of that comes from seeing role models or seeing other students that you have before you that did that work really well. An example, I'm going to keep talking about Columbia because it's right over there. But we had this fantastic student at Columbia last year who so bravely spoke to this issue. And he graduated, Jacob Schmeltz, look him up, he's going to be the president someday. And this year we have another fantastic student at Columbia, Abigail Fixel, look her up, she'll also be the president someday. These students who probably wouldn't have even known how to get involved a year ago see someone else who did it, and that inspires them to want to also. So I think really the community of it all is just inseparable from the advocacy of it all.
I want to come back to social media, but I want to first ask you about the commission that you served on, convened by the first gentleman, I forget how many years ago. Very big, splashy, a lot of press, convening Jewish leaders to combat anti-Semitism. How did that go? Right? And then 10/7 happened, and we didn't hear anything from them, really. So that's me being cynical, by the way. Talk to us about that experience a little bit.
Yeah.
As a professional, the efficacy of that commission, or is it still at work? Did it move the needle at all in this conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. I was a part of the group that was convened by the White House in, I think it was end of 2022, which feels like it was yesterday, but it was totally not yesterday, to work on the national strategy to combat anti-Semitism. At the time, it was definitely one of, an experience that I never thought I would be having when I went into doing,
You were still in college.
I was still in college. Yeah, I was 21, and significantly the youngest person at that table, which at the beginning was very intimidating. And I will say there's something to be said for really incredible mentors, also really incredible women mentors who really, have taken me and other young students under their wings to really give us the power to have those voices. But I remember I was incredibly nervous about it because my first time speaking to a politician was speaking at the White House. Like that was a big jump for me. Yeah, I was very nervous. And a fun fact about it is I totally lost my voice earlier that week and probably was the most stressful experience getting it back beforehand. Not relevant to the rest of the story, but an aside. But I mean, at the time, it was also an opportunity that I knew students hadn't had before me. First of all, it was the first convening of its sort, right after they announced the creation of the White House National Strategy to combat anti-Semitism, which was the first of its kind. So that was inherently, I guess, a unique thing, but also, I mean, having students in that room was unique. And I will say I'm really proud to see that ever since then, there have always been students in that room, and that was something that started then but didn't end then. And I think that it was impactful to see that work start, and there is so much work that has to continue happening. I mean, there's work that has to be done for the civil level, for university administrators, for people who own organizations, for groups like, for example, athletic conferences, things that you don't think about. Those, civil everyday organizations that impact the lives of students. And not just students, Jews in general. There's more that has to be done for these, responses to be adequate. From those organizations. There's opportunities for students to file Title VI complaints that the Department of Education is pushing out, and there's more work to be done.
Do you think that, and did any of that result from this meeting?
Yeah, and I think one thing that was great about that session, and I can only speak highly of that experience, was that all of those concerns were listened to. And of course, any administration doesn't control the money that goes to the Department of Education. So they really can't help on that front of getting them more funding to hire more staff to adequately respond to anti-Semitism. But they can at least call for the Department of Education, for example, to do more. Of course, you can't control what a CEO of a corporation does, but you can call for them to do more. And I think as much, as there is left to be done, it was a really great first, commitment that hadn't existed before. And it's been really incredible to see more students engaged in the civil process than we'd seen on the Hill, locally, federal levels.
So let's talk about social media. It's obviously a part of your origin story. We know it's a double-edged sword. We heard Ono talk about it. We can understand completely what the double-edged sword is. How do you navigate that tension in your work? What are you seeing in the social media world, both in terms of the spread of anti-Semitism, anti-Israel, and how are you using it to amplify your message?
Absolutely, yeah. There is no shortage of anti-Semitism on social media. That doesn't shock anyone in this room. I mean, it is a serious problem. And mis and disinformation has so rapidly spread since before October 7th and since. And it's almost like a social media currency, like something like taking for granted people, if someone shares a post on Instagram and then all of your friends are resharing that post, there almost becomes a social pressure that you have to reshare it also. And then if you're being silent, people are so pressured and feel like there is a need to engage, and that's what spreads it. That spreads the message. And I think that there's a real tendency to say, okay, anti-Semitism is awful on social media, let's leave social media because it is unproductive. And I think that is a natural inclination that I understand, and I wish I could delete my Twitter page. But you can't, because the more that we allow these spaces to be ceded to anti-Semitism, the more that's all that will exist on the platform. If all we have on Twitter or Instagram or TikTok is really awful anti-Semitic content, is this mis and disinformation that's really influencing an entire generation of people not to understand Jewish identity. If we're not, matching their energy and also putting important education online and having it react and resonate with students, then we're missing out on the battle. We're not even showing up. And that's really, in the long run, going to harm us.
How are you utilizing social media? How's your organization?
Yeah, I mean, we're born from social media. That was how we started. And I think there's a tendency to almost take for granted how impactful it can be to create content that goes viral also. Because what you see is so much virality around content that's very much, anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, attacking Jewish students who identify with Zionism. And that's popular. And the more that is shared, the more people will see it. So we have to also share content that people can see. And that does one of those two things. One is educate, because people do, if you look at responses of Gen Z and where they get most of their news, a large portion of Gen Z gets that from TikTok, from Instagram. So if they're getting their news there, we have to be there, number one. And number two is having vocal leaders who can identify proudly and openly with their Jewish identity. Having them also sharing their stories through social media creates that chain reaction we spoke about earlier that will empower more people to be engaged.
Yeah, I mean, I've just noticed an explosion of these very pro-Israel social media types. Are you partnering with them? Are you producing your own content? Like, I'm just curious, because of your origins and because of the population you're dealing with, how is that content being created?
Yeah, I mean, for us, we are an interesting case because we started on social media, and social media is a big piece of our work, and we're a nonprofit. So a lot of our work is, determining what happened, how can we articulate that in a way that sounds, feels, is speaking to the moment of Gen Z, because we know that, we're part of that community. How can we resonate with people who this messaging hasn't resonated with before? And how can we educate through that? So for us, that's been a real process of developing our brand, our voice, our work over the past almost 5 years. And there are now a lot of folks who use their voice and use their content, their brand, to speak to things that they can speak to. So I can't speak to the experience of what it's like to be a professor, because I'm not a professor, I've never been. But I can speak to what it's like to be a Gen Z Jew. I can speak to what it's like to be a Jewish student on campus in the past couple of years. And there's a lot of power in that. How can we take these experiences and turn them into stories that can teach others those experiences? So working, finding ways to amplify those voices is really important.
You brought up professors, and this came up in the previous session. And I'm just curious, in your work with students, take, for example, what happened on Columbia this week. They break into a class. Students contact you, Julia, this happened. Help us navigate this relationship between, in this case, it was a Jewish teacher, but a Jewish professor. But how do you sort of counsel students around working with professors or experiencing anti-Israel, anti-Semitism from a professor where there's a natural power imbalance there?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's such a hard situation, because any advice that I give the student, ultimately I'm not the one that gets the grade in that class. And some students will understandably feel nervous or uncomfortable reporting that situation because they want to get into med school or law school, and getting a poor grade in that class isn't a risk that they can take. And that's understandable. But there is, recourse. There are things that they can do. And retaliation from a university professor isn't allowed by university guidelines. So these students should be reporting these instances to their university administration, to their department, having it on the record, doing it either anonymously or not, depending on their comfort level. And in those situations, students are sometimes understandably intimidated to do something like that because it could potentially blow back on them. So the advice is always to report, but never to judge if students aren't comfortable yet.
Are you in touch with administrators at all? Are you just dealing with students? And how have you found that experience of working with campus officials?
Yeah, I mean, we've worked with university administrators. We've also worked with partner organizations who, are all together, working together with university administrators. A lot of the time, it's, university administrators will understandably take meetings with trustees and donors and people who, have a lot of skin in the game. And students don't have as much. So it's how can we get students in front of university administrators, and also how can we get students in front of trustees, in front of donors, in front of people who have a little more influence, a little more influence than they do, and have them be able to articulate what's actually happening on campus.
Yeah, when Mark Rowan spoke last night, I thought one of the most effective things he told us was that they went to Hillel on a Friday night and sat down with a bunch of students for Shabbat dinner and actually listen to what the students are experiencing, because it often feels like, I see this in my kids' school, and now they're younger and they don't have the same agency, but it can't be that I'm more upset than my kids, right? Like the students have to be able to articulate to the donors or the trustees or the alumni what's happening. And I don't know how often that actually happens.
Yeah, and I guess to go back to what we were talking about at the beginning, sometimes the worst feelings that students have aren't from things that are making headlines. It's really understanding where these problems are for these students and responding to them. Sometimes that means that their coaches don't understand what Yom Kippur is, or their professors aren't giving them resources for Rosh Hashanah, different things like that. Sometimes it's these bigger things. Sometimes it's at their campus club. Like, people don't know that the dance club at Columbia University wasn't had an anti-Zionist clause. You wouldn't know that if you weren't talking to a student that wanted to join the dance club. And I think that's really important.
All right, so Julia, let's imagine your 17-year-old self. You're a senior in high school at Park Avenue. You live in New York, and you're part of the Park Avenue Synagogue community. And you are part of a 15 to 20-person cohort who's been studying and learning and experiencing around these issues for the last 2 years, whether it's Jewish identity, Israel education, being able to identify anti-Semitism, et cetera, and the 25-year-old version of Julia Jassey shows up because you have an opportunity to have dinner with these 20 students and tell them, here's what I would like you to know before you go to college. What are you going to say to these kids?
Yeah, it's funny that you say that because my little sister went off to college last year, and I was thinking a lot about these conversations with her when she was going back to school, or going to school. I think that you can have all the conversations with them about the kind of hard science behind anti-Semitism. What are the tropes that you see permutating over a long time? But then there also is the feeling that comes with it, and how are you going to respond to it? And I think never feeling that sort of shame is important. But I think the most important thing that I would say is that you shouldn't do it by yourself. You're going to have times when you want to respond, and you're going to do it in that moment, and it's going to be scary, and you want to have someone that you could talk to afterward. I mean, one thing that I really loved about doing this work with Jewish on Campus, with the community, is sometimes when we get the most horrific hate comments, we'll send it to each other and make jokes about it. And that's so Jewish. We need to be able to laugh it off. We need to be able to have that positive strength. But it's really hard. And I don't think that I would be doing this for as long as I have been if it were alone. Because then also, what are you fighting for? We do everything together as Jews. We pray together. We eat together. We do everything together. And this should be the same. Never, feel alone in it, because there is a community for you when you look for it. And doing it together will allow you to do it longer, to do it stronger, to do it better, and to not feel completely burdened by all of this. And then, research blood libel and learn about it.
Julia, thank you. I hope you do this for a long time. We are, our community, the Jewish community is stronger with your presence. So thank you for being here. Thank you, everyone.